Every man who crossed that stretch of West Texas in the 1860s knew it could kill him. 80 miles without a single drop of water, beneath a sun that pushed surface temperatures past 120 degrees. Experienced cattlemen had crossed it and died. Hardened soldiers had crossed it and gone mad with thirst. But one trail boss crossed it, read the land the way other men read scripture, and arrived alive. Not because he was lucky, not because he was fearless, but because he understood something sitting in plain sight since the beginning of time. Something the modern world decided wasn't worth teaching anymore. The trick wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a gadget or a government program or a subscription service. It was knowledge so old and so simple that we forgot to pass it on. And the forgetting has cost us more than most people will ever realize. That trail boss was Charles Goodnight. The year was 1866, and what he understood about finding water in a waterless landscape is something you almost certainly were never taught, because the system that replaced it had no real interest in you knowing it. Walk out onto the Llano Estacado in the summer of 1866, and you would feel the danger before you fully understood it. The land was flat as a tabletop and featureless in every direction. The horizon, a perfect unbroken line, where pale sky and pale earth blurred together in the heat shimmer until you genuinely could not tell where the ground ended and the air began. The soil was baked clay and caliche, cracked into hard geometric plates like the surface of a dead planet. The grass was the color of old bone. The sun was a white disk, not yellow, not orange, just white, pressing down on everything like a physical weight that accumulated with every hour you spent under it. No shade, no wind, no sound except the dry creak of saddle leather and the shuffle of hooves on cracked earth. Nothing to suggest water had ever existed anywhere in this world, let alone within walking distance. And yet, Charles Goodnight, a former Texas Ranger who had spent years tracking Comanche raiders across this exact terrain until he knew every fold and hollow of it by instinct, pushed 2,000 longhorns across 80 miles of that landscape and brought them out the other side. When the herd finally smelled the Pecos River, they stampeded so violently that over 400 head drowned in quicksand or were crushed by the surging animals behind them. That was the victory. That was what survival looked like on the Goodnight-loving trail, and it only happened because Goodnight knew exactly where the water was, how far off it sat, and how to manage the moment when they finally reached it. Meanwhile, at Horsehead Crossing on the Pecos, the very destination he was driving toward, he counted 13 graves, 13 cowboys who had attempted the same crossing before him without his knowledge, 13 men who died, not because the water wasn't there, but because they could not read the land that was hiding it. So what did Goodnight know that those 13 men didn't? That is the question this entire video is going to answer completely. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever been handed instructions you followed faithfully, only to discover they were designed to serve someone else's purpose and not yours? A program that promised results and delivered nothing. Advice you trusted completely that turned out to be built on someone else's profit margin. A system that failed you and then told you the failure was personal. Drop that in the comments below, because what you're about to discover will change how you see the relationship between ancient, tested knowledge and the modern systems that quietly replaced it. Here is what modern survival culture gets catastrophically wrong about finding water in arid terrain. Open any standard wilderness survival guide published in the last 50 years, and the instructions for locating water in desert environments typically read something like this. Look for low-lying areas, dig in dry creek beds, follow animal trails downhill. These are not entirely wrong, but they are fragments. They are the instruction manual with half the pages torn out and the binding glued back together so neatly you wouldn't notice anything was missing. They are the recipe with the single most critical ingredient removed. And the reason those pages are missing isn't incompetence on the part of the authors. It's that the knowledge they should contain was never written down, because the people who held it didn't communicate through writing. They taught it person to person, season to season, generation to generation. across thousands of years of unbroken engagement with specific landscapes. When that transmission chain broke across the American West within a single compressed generation, the knowledge didn't become rare, it became invisible. What replaced it was a pale, severed fragment dressed up and passed off as the whole. You were handed the copy. Nobody mentioned the original existed. Here's where it gets worse. The men who died on those waterless stretches were not fools. The soldiers of the 10th Cavalry who perished on the Llano Estacado in 1877, the event the Galveston Daily News called the Staked Plains Horror, were trained, disciplined men under a competent commander. Captain Nicholas Nolan led 40 Buffalo soldiers across the Staked Plains in pursuit of Comanche raiders and became lost on that featureless expanse for 86 hours without a single drop of water. 4 soldiers and a buffalo hunter died. The survivors drank horse blood and their own urine just to stay conscious enough to keep moving. They were not unprepared by the standards of their institution. What they lacked was one specific layer of ecological knowledge, the exact same knowledge that the Comanche they were chasing carried as naturally as language. And that gap was not an accident of nature. It was the direct product of a system that valued standardized military procedure over indigenous land literacy, that treated the earth as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a library to be read. The failure was not theirs. The system handed them a broken map and then blamed them for getting lost. And understand, the villain here is never a single person with bad intentions. It is never one greedy man pulling strings in a back room. The villain is institutional dismissal, the systematic, deliberate decision made across the 19th and 20th centuries to classify traditional ecological knowledge as primitive superstition, to strip it from public consciousness, and to replace it with solutions that could be scaled, packaged, and sold. Your inability to read a desert landscape today is not a personal failure. The knowledge was taken off the curriculum before you were born, and then the very people who removed it turned around and blamed you for the gap they created. You are not broken. You were given broken instructions. That is a completely different thing, and it matters deeply that you understand the difference. So what did the survivors actually know? Walk through it with me completely, because each piece of this forms part of an integrated system that kept human beings alive in these landscapes for thousands of years before a single water pipe was ever laid. The first thing Goodnight understood, and the thing almost nobody teaches today, was what the plants around him were actively trying to communicate. Certain trees in the American West are what ecologists call phytophytes, plants that drive their root systems all the way down to the permanent water table rather than depending on the shallow, unreliable moisture near the soil surface. Cottonwood trees are the most powerful signal in the West. A cottonwood cannot survive on surface rainfall alone. It doesn't bluff, it doesn't grow in dry ground, and silently suffer. It simply doesn't grow there at all. If you can see a cottonwood grove standing green against a bone-dry landscape, there is permanent groundwater beneath it at accessible depth. Without exception, a single mature cottonwood transpires somewhere between 200 and 500 liters of water every single day, drawing it upward continuously from the depths and releasing it as invisible vapor. It is a pump running day and night without stopping, and its green canopy is the land's own way of marking what is buried below. Think of it like a flag planted directly over hidden treasure, and the flag never lies. Willows operate on the same principle. Mesquite trees push root systems documented at over 175 feet below the surface, meaning a living mesquite grove in desert country signals groundwater even when the surface is cracked powder and looks completely dead in every direction. The cowboys who died at Horsehead Crossing did not know how to read any of this. Charles Goodnight, who had spent years ranging the Llano alongside some of the most capable trackers on the continent, had absorbed every signal until they were as automatic and unconscious as breathing. But vegetation was only the beginning. Here is where it gets even more remarkable. Mourning doves must drink every single day. They carry no physiological reserve against dehydration the way some desert species do. They need water, and so they fly toward it every morning and every evening. in straight, direct, completely purposeful lines with no detours, no wandering, no circling. Watch the direction of dove flight at dawn and at dusk in desert country, and you are watching a living compass with exactly one setting pointing at the nearest water source. This is documented, specific, and entirely verifiable, and it once saved an entire family from Death Valley. In 1849, during the catastrophic Lost 49ers ordeal, a young woman named Almira Wade watched birds flying overhead and then disappearing over a nearby ridge. She followed them and discovered Saratoga Spring. Her family drank from it, survived the valley, and walked out on their own feet, becoming the only party in that entire expedition to bring their wagon out intact. One observation, one sustained act of attention to the natural world, an entire family alive who would otherwise have been bones in the sand. She was paying exactly the kind of attention that we have completely stopped teaching anyone to pay. And then there is the geology. This is where the science becomes genuinely astonishing because it reveals that water in the desert is not randomly hidden. It is structurally hidden, and structure can be read. Underground water moves through permeable rock, sandstone, fractured limestone, coarse gravel beds until it hits an impermeable barrier like dense clay or shale. Where that barrier angles toward the surface, the water follows it upward and emerges as a spring. Fault lines create fracture networks that allow water to rise from depth. Contact zones between different rock formations create natural outlets where water is forced sideways until it finds a way out. The base of alluvial fans, those broad, sloping gravel deposits spreading out from the foot of desert mountain ranges, concentrate both runoff and the porous material that holds it close to the surface. This is why digging at the base of desert hills or at the outside bend of a dry creek channel, where fine sediment and subsurface moisture concentrate together, frequently produces water just a foot or two down. A person who understood these patterns could walk across terrain that appeared uniformly dead and identify with genuine confidence the specific locations most likely to yield water. Not through mystical intuition, but through pattern recognition built and sharpened over years of direct, attentive observation. Pauline Weaver, the scout born to a white father and a Cherokee mother, possessed this literacy so completely that when he guided the Mormon battalion through unfamiliar Arizona territory in 1846, 400 men across country, even he had never personally walked, he kept every single one of them alive. Multiple mountain ranges, peaks, and waterways in Arizona still carry his name today because his single, most irreplaceable quality was knowing where the water was. If you're finding this valuable, if this is shifting how you see the land around you, consider subscribing. We're getting to the part that should make you genuinely angry. Animal trails are the final piece that closes the whole picture. In desert country, established game trails converge on water with the structural reliability of wheel spokes meeting at a hub. Every well-worn trail in dry terrain leads somewhere that living things need to go, and in arid country, that destination is water. Follow any consistent animal trail downhill in desert country, and it will deliver you to a source, not sometimes, not usually, but as a direct consequence of how those trails were originally formed. The Comanche organized their entire civilization on the Llano Estacado around water points encoded in tribal memory across generations, passed down as critical knowledge to every young person, the way other cultures taught reading or arithmetic. When the Buffalo Soldiers were dying of thirst on that same plain in 1877, the Comanche they were pursuing were not suffering. Same terrain, same merciless white sun, a completely different knowledge base. And the part that should sit uncomfortably with you is this. The U.S. government was, at that precise historical moment, actively waging war against the communities that held this knowledge. It was militarily dismantling the very civilizations whose ecological literacy could have saved those soldiers' lives. And then, decades later, that same government published a 59-page pamphlet through the U.S. Geological Survey in 1917, formally debunking water dowsing, the folk tradition that had organically grown up to partially fill the knowledge gap left behind, as mere superstition. The institutional response to destroying the original knowledge system was to publicly ridicule the imperfect substitute that rose to take its place. So, why was all of this abandoned so completely? Three reasons, and they are the same three reasons every effective traditional system gets discarded when industrial civilization expands over it. First, speed. Traditional water literacy required years of direct, embodied experience in specific landscapes to develop with any reliability. It could not be standardized into a manual, trained in a 6-week program, or deployed at scale. Second, cost. A scout who had absorbed the complete hydrological knowledge of an entire region was irreplaceable, and irreplaceability is expensive. Standardized infrastructure, however fragile, could be built with hired labor and operated by workers, requiring no deep knowledge whatsoever. Third, technology made the question seem permanently solved. When deep drilling equipment became commercially viable in the late 19th century, and when geologists confirmed the Ogallala Aquifer, a buried freshwater body roughly the size of Lake Huron lying directly beneath the very plains where so many had perished, the urgent need to read the landscape for water collapsed almost overnight. The hidden cost took generations to surface. A civilization built entirely on mechanical extraction cannot function the moment those systems begin to fail. The Ogallala has been dropping measurably for decades. The knowledge that would allow people to find water without industrial infrastructure is nearly gone. We traded a living, resilient system of understanding for a product. The product is aging. The wisdom cannot be quickly rebuilt from nothing. So, what do you do with all of this right now? Three options, from simplest to most committed. Start with vegetation. Learn which trees in your specific region are phrydophytes. In the American West, that means cottonwoods and willows as your primary markers. In the Southeast, sycamores play the same role. Learn to identify them at a distance in every season and every light condition. On any land you own, manage, or care about, map where these trees cluster naturally. That clustering is a reliable map of subsurface water that no app or satellite service will ever generate for you. It is free, permanent, and was considered essential knowledge by every person who survived in these landscapes before centralized water infrastructure existed. If you want to go further, learn to read topography for water concentration, study the base of hill slopes where alluvial material accumulates, note the outside bends of dry channels. Watch for contact zones where dark, moist-looking soil transitions sharply into pale, dry, crumbling earth, because that transition often marks the underground, boundary between permeable and impermeable geology, exactly where water gathers close to the surface. And at the absolute minimum, if nothing else from today stays with you, learn the bird signals. Watch dove and pigeon flight direction in early morning and the last hour before dark. In dry country, that direction is pointing at water. Test it once, note the bearing. Check a map for a water source along that line. Do it a handful of times, and the pattern will become impossible to ignore. No equipment, no expertise, no cost. The exact technique that walked Elmira Wade's family out of Death Valley alive. Charles Goodnight was not a mystic. He was a man taught through years of direct and unforgiving experience to read the land at a depth the modern world decided was too slow and too personal to preserve. Moroni Stone, the 78-year-old water witch of Simi Valley, who walked onto a drought-stricken California ranch in 1925 with a peach branch and located a flowing, artesian well after professional drillers had completely given up, was not magic either. He was the last living carrier of a knowledge tradition the industrial age had already decided it no longer required. The knowledge was never lost. It was abandoned, traded away for infrastructure that turned out to be far more fragile than the wisdom it replaced. We are digging up exactly this kind of knowledge: frontier survival intelligence, traditional land literacy, and time-tested systems the modern world left behind because they couldn't be easily packaged or sold. Subscribe if you want to keep uncovering it, and tell us in the comments, what forgotten skill or buried knowledge do you want us to investigate next?